السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Today inshallah we will continue with our penultimate chapter, which is before the last chapter, which is chapter 14, IT security management and risk assessment. Along from the beginning of this semester, we talked about a number of technical and administrative measures that we have to apply to control the security of the organizations in general. Now, in this chapter, we will go further and talk about the security management and risk assessment. How we are going to make sure that the technical and administrative security controls that we put in place are maintained and are complied with. Okay, so in general, the IT security management from the first chapter at the first week, if you can remember, we talked about these three main questions that we need to answer. What assets need to be protected? We need to determine them, and then we need to identify the threats surrounding these assets. So we need to answer the second question: how are those assets threatened? And then, after identifying the assets and identifying the threats on those assets, we need now to decide the countermeasures to those assets. So the third question is, what can be done to counter those threats? Okay, so we need to ensure that critical assets are sufficiently protected in a cost-effective manner. Now we are recapping all what we have been studying throughout this semester with some emphasis here. Okay, so the security risk assessment is needed for each asset in the organization that requires protection. You remember that we talked about the balance, the trade-off that we need to consider carefully while we are deciding what countermeasures, what security solutions we are going to put in place. We need to consider the value of the asset to the organization. We need to consider the cost of adopting the countermeasures. Okay, we need to consider other things like user acceptability, for example. Will our staff members will accept that? Does that countermeasure intervene, for example, with our staff privacy, for example? Does it affect their health? If you may remember, when we talked about the retina scan, we said that it is one of the most accurate biometrics. So it is okay, it is the most accurate biometrics, so it might be considered the most secure solution for user authentication, but we need to consider the user acceptability, the staff acceptability. Will our staff accept to use it for the daily usage, for example, for their daily attendance? Will they consider it as a health threat? Some may have fear on their eyes, so it may affect their sight, for example, and so on. And as a result, we may have a resistance from the users. So at the end, we will turn up of implementation failure. Okay, so the security risk assessment provides the information necessary to decide, for the top management to decide what countermeasures or what controls to put in place, either those countermeasures from the management or operational or technical perspectives. Okay, so these are the main three questions that we need to answer in order to have a successful IT security management. These are some standards from ISO that you don't need to memorize them, but you need to know that there is an organization that is credible enough worldwide to set some standards for different organizations to adopt or to acquire the accreditation from different perspectives. So if we are going to define IT security management, it is the main process here. So it is a process used to achieve and maintain appropriate levels of confidentiality, integrity, availability, the main CIA, and with them accountability, authenticity, and reliability. We said that all these three cannot be done, accountability, authenticity, and reliability cannot be done without having a strong controls on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So they are serving each other. And on top of them, we have the other three A's of you, if we can consider them as services, enforcing these all six concepts or levels that are authentication, authorization, and this one is the accountability or auditing in general. Okay, so what are the functions? We said that the questions of IT security management were the three ones that we mentioned in the first chapter, in the first slide also here. And here, these are the functions of IT security management. So they are derived from those three questions. Okay, determining organizational IT security objectives, strategies, and policies. On top of that, we need to determine the organization security strategy and security policies in order to have a basement or reference of all countermeasures that we are going to put in place, to apply, to implement as security top priority of this organization, or no, it is second priority or third. So we care about other things rather than the IT security, and so on. The second function is to determine organization's IT security requirements. So to achieve the IT security objectives, strategies, and policies, we need to determine the requirements to achieve them. Then to identify and analyze security threats. Now to IT assets within the organization. Okay, so here with the fourth one, identifying and analyzing the risks, we are going to answer directly the first and second main questions of IT security management, determining the assets and their threats and risks on them. Okay, and the fifth one here, which is answering the third main question there, is specifying appropriate safeguards, countermeasures, controls, Okay, then after that, now we have assessed the safeguards and we have selected the appropriate one. Now we need to monitor the implementation and operations of those safeguards that we have selected and we have implemented, to monitor their implementation, their operation, in order to cost effectively protect the information and services within the organization. So we need to make sure that they are running all the time and they are doing what they are, what it is meant from them, what is required from them. Okay, on on top of that, we need to develop and implement security awareness program. So as we said that usually the human aspect is unimportant of all technical solutions. Here in security, they said that humans are the weakest block on the chain of security. So it will not make sense, or it will not be enough just to acquire the best security solutions and then our security staff don't know how to use them properly, and our end user staff don't know about them or do other things that violate that security solution and will not make it working properly. Okay, finally, the eighth function here is to detect and react to incidents. So from determining the organizational security objectives, strategies, and policies, all the way to the incidents detection and reactions. These are the main 8 functions of IT security management. Okay, so this is the overview of what we have talked about, and we will go in some details with some of these blocks. So we have at the top IT security policy and organizational aspects. They will feed the risk analysis options, security risk analysis. We have 4 different approaches. We will talk about each one of them: baseline, informal, formal, and combined. So based on either or any one of these approaches we will conduct for risk analysis, then we will select the controls, we will develop the security plan, and then the procedures, and after that we will implement the controls, the safeguards, along with the security awareness training. Okay, and at the end or after that we need to follow up, we need maintenance, the monitoring for security compliance, change management if we need to change things based on our experience with the implementation, and the incident handling in terms of detection and reaction and response. Okay, based on the results of the maintenance, security compliance, change management, incident handling, we can feed back the risk analysis options. We might encounter some new things that we didn't consider on our initial risk analysis options. So we need to revise our risk analysis, and maybe based on that we may need to select other controls or update the implementation. So for the plan, this is the famous plan, do, check, act process model. It's called plan, do, check, act. So based on, as we said, the security strategies, policies, and objectives of the organizations. We can plan. After planning, we do, means that we implement the things. After the implementation, we need to keep checking, keep monitoring, keep maintaining, and based on that, we need to have detection and incidents handling, like act, the reaction. Based on that, we go back to the loop to revise our plan and do, check, act again. So the first function that we mentioned is to examine the organization's IT security. So we need to set, if they are not already set, the objectives in terms of security. What are the IT security outcomes that are desired for the organizations, the strategies how we are going to meet these objectives that we set, and then what needs to be done, all for achieving the objectives. So we need to keep them maintained and updated regularly, either periodically, after having periodic reviews, or after reflecting the change after an incident or from our experience. Okay, these are the main points that needs to be considered in any security policy. Just or roughly, we need to determine the scope and purpose, then the requirements, the responsibilities, who is responsible for what. We need to select the risk management approach, security awareness and training, who is responsible about it, how long should it last, and so on. One of the main things here to address is the contingency and business continuity planning. It is called BCP. Sometimes the disaster recovery is linked with it. So BCP, business continuity planning, and sometimes and DP, DRP, disaster recovery planning, or in other words, the contingency, the emergency plan. How we can keep our business running if a disaster or an interruption or if any emergency happened. These days, with the spread of the coronavirus, the need for business continuity planning has been raised, and it is now shown that it is crucial, it is very important for every business to have this continuity planning in order to make sure that the business is running in situations or circumstances similar to this. We talked about incident detection and handling processes and reaction. To the management support, IT security policy must be supported by senior management. This is very important. Without the support from senior management, there is high probability that the IT security objectives will not be met, will not be achieved due to some of the obstacles that may encounter the IT security staff without the support with senior management, like buying specific solutions or adopting a solution, a countermeasure, a control that is considered expensive from financial perspective without IT security backgrounds, or from those that do not consider the IT security as a priority. Okay, so there is a need for every organization to have an IT security officer. Sometimes it is, in some organizations it is at the same level with the CEO, Chief Executive Officer. They have CIO, security, the Chief Information Officer, or CISO, CISO they call it, which is Chief Information Security Officer. It is needed in order to be directly under the umbrella of senior management, of uh, to be very close to the decision makers, to provide consistent overall supervision, to arrange with senior management, to manage the IT security awareness and training programs, and so on. Large organizations need separate IT project security officers associated with the major project and systems. This is even realized locally here or nationally by the National Authority of Cybersecurity, الهيئة السعودية أو الهيئة الوطنية للأمن السيبراني here, and they issued an instruction, a guide to all organizations to have a separate cybersecurity department that is not under the umbrella of IT, but direct under the top management, the senior management of that organization. This is an important one, the security risk assessment. It is a critical component of the process of IT security management in general. It ideally examines every organization's asset, but this is not feasible in practice to go to each single small, minor, tiny, or big major one asset and examine their risk or do risk assessment to them. So there have been some approaches that have been proposed to identify and mitigate the risks on the organization's IT infrastructure. Namely, they are baseline, informal, detailed risk assessment, and combined. Let's talk about each one of them. Again, use your common sense with the naming. Baseline approach, risk assessment here. The goal is to implement agreed controls to provide protection against the most common threats. So it is baseline. Just the consideration here is about the common threats. So it forms a good base for further security measures. So usually it uses industry best practice. So the most common threats that are usually well known will be taken care of. So this, as you can imagine here, that it is easy, cheap, and can be replicated, can be repeated from time to time, periodically, with the same things. But it has some disadvantages, like it gives no special considerations to variations in risk exposure. Also, it may give, as you can infer, too much or too little security, as there might be other threats that are not common, but they are critical threats that we may face in our organizations. So it is the baseline approach. Generally, it is recommended only for small organizations without resources to implement more structured approach. Okay. The second one, the informal one. From its name, it will consider more than the most common threats, but in a way that it is informal. It is not very structured. It is not very formal or very detailed. It involves conducting an informal, pragmatic risk analysis on organization's IT system. Based on what? Based on the knowledge and expertise of analysts. It is kind of better than the baseline, or let's say it is more comprehensive than the baseline one, as it is fairly quick and cheap also. But some risks may be incorrectly assessed because it is difficult to have the security analyst that has the expertise with all possible threats that we may receive or we may encounter. So it is skewed by analysts' views that may vary from time to time. Okay, so we can infer here that it is suitable for small to medium-sized organizations where IT systems are not necessarily essential, not large organizations. The detailed one, the number 3, the detailed one. From its name, it is absolutely the most comprehensive approach compared with baseline and informal. It assesses the risks using formal structured process. It's very structured. Based on the number of different stages, identify threats and vulnerabilities to assets, then identify the likelihood of risk occurring and its consequences. A very detailed one and very formal one. Unfortunately, although that it seems very structured, very comprehensive, but it may incur significant cost in time and resources. So it consumes more time and resources than the informal and the baseline one. There might be legal requirements to use. It is suitable for large organizations with IT systems critical to their business objectives. But the time and resources consumption should be considered carefully. In order to have like a balanced approach, this is the fourth one, the combined approach. So it combines elements of other 3 approaches. So the initial baseline on all systems to assess the risks based on the most common threats. Then the informal analysis to identify critical risks based on the point of view expertise of the analysts. Then for those critical systems or assets, we need to consider formal assessments. Okay, so it results in the development of strategic picture of the IT resources and where major risks are likely to occur. So we are not wasting the time and resources on assessing everything in a detailed way, in a detailed approach. But we are focusing on the critical things. Okay, so it might be considered as the most effective approach and the most cost effective one. So it is the most highly recommended for almost all kinds of organizations, especially the large ones. Okay, so if we are thinking about the detailed security risk analysis for all assets, we mentioned that it provides the most accurate evaluation, but it is the highest one of them in terms of the cost. So generally, any risk assessment process will follow these four steps or processes. So step one is to prepare for assessment. Then conduct the risk assessment by identifying the threats, sources, and events, identify vulnerabilities and conditions, determine likelihood of occurrence, determine magnitude of impact, and determine the risks. Then we communicate the results with the concerned departments or people from the management. And the fourth one, maintain the assessment. Keep doing the assessments. This is just a general assessment based on the risk context in general, but it cannot be publicized. That the least vulnerable organizations that are working with agriculture and constructions, then moving towards education, media, communications, up to the most vulnerable is the banking and government. But again, it depends. It cannot be generalized. But this is just a general tendency. So for asset identification, just to emphasize the point, the asset is anything which needs to be protected on the organizations. It has value to organizations to meet its objectives, either tangible, touchable, and tangible or intangible. Logical one. Whose compromise or loss would seriously impact the operations of the organizations. This is a recap. We have kept repeating those terminologies throughout this semester: the asset, threat, vulnerability, and risk. Gain, risk, anything that has value to the organization. The threat, a potential cause of an unwanted incident which may result in harm to a system or organization. Vulnerability, it is a weakness in an asset or group of assets which can be exploited by a threat. And the risk is the potential that a given threat will exploit the vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets to cause loss or damage to the assets or to the organizations as a whole. So in order to identify the threats, so we identified the assets, now we identify the threats. The threat is anything that might hinder like thwart The other words is like slowing down. Okay? Or prevent an asset from providing appropriate levels of key security services. So it might be related to confidentiality, integrity, availability, accountability, authenticity, or reliability. Against any or some or all of them. So the threats sources may be natural, they call them acts of God. Okay, like flooding, for example, or like even the pandemic of any viruses like coronavirus now also. Okay, like fire. So these are causes of threats, acts of God, natural. The other one is man-made, so it is carried out by a human, okay, or accidental or deliberate. Accidental by technical failure and so on. So the evaluation of human threat resources or sources should consider the motivation. What is the motivation behind that? The capability. Is it done by individual or team, or is it a state sponsored, or what? The resources they have, the probability of an attack, and the deterrence. Any previous experience or expertise of attacks seen by the organizations also needs to be considered, as some organizations might be more vulnerable to some risks more than others. The vulnerability identification identify the weaknesses that might be exploited or can be exploited. So we need a combination of threat and vulnerability to create a risk to an asset. So the threat can exploit a vulnerability to create a risk. So the outcome should be a list of threats and vulnerabilities with brief description of how and why they might occur. After defining or identifying the threats and vulnerabilities, now we can analyze the risks, specify the likelihood of occurrence of each identified threat to assets given existing controls. So if we put specific controls, countermeasures in place, what is the likelihood of that threat to happen? So this is the risk. What is the probability of that to happen? So it specifies the consequence also. Should the threat happen, if the threat occur, the consequences, the implications will be this and this, will be high, low level, low, medium, low, or high. So it derive overall risk rating for each threat. This formula can be used. So the risk equals probability threat occurs multiplies by the cost to the organizations. It is hard to determine accurate probabilities and realistic cost consequences, but it is used as qualitative, not quantitative. So analyzing the existing controls, the existing solutions or countermeasures, do they minimize the threats or not, or even do they try to prevent them or not? Those security controls can be from the perspective of managerial things, or operational or technical processes or procedures. So a checklist of existing controls and interview key organizational staff to solicit information. So in addition to the assessment of the security analyst or expert, it is highly recommended to interview the staff, either the key ones or the all end users of specific countermeasures or of specific systems that we need to protect, because they will be the most aware ones, most aware staff about the system that they are working on the daily basis. They know its flaws and it is strength saving, and they may suggest some solutions that it is more realistic than someone or some expert or analyst from far from the daily usage or not or cannot be thinking like the end user. So this is an example of the matrix that can be used to determine the risk likelihood from 1 to 5, or rare, unlikely, possible, likely, almost certain. But again, these levels or ranking or rating are not inclusive or not the only ones. Other ways can be used. This is for the consequences, the implications, the results of that risk if it happens. So the consequence, it might be insignificant, like trivial, almost nothing, minor, moderate, major, catastrophic, and doomsday. If we can combine them together, the likelihood of the consequences and the risks, we can come up with those different levels, risk levels: low, medium, high, and extreme. Again, this is just an example that you can adopt or you can customize to suit your own organizations. And this is a risk register that we can put all of them in place: the asset, the threats and vulnerability, the existing controls, and the likelihood for that risk to happen, the consequences, its level, and the priority. If the resources of an organization is limited, so there is a need to determine the priority. So the resources can be directed based on these priorities. Finally, this is the risk treatment alternatives. It is an important slide that, based on all the identification of assets, threats, vulnerabilities, risks, and their risk levels, now we need to decide how we are going to deal with this risk. We have different options, there are different alternatives to treat this risk. These are the 5 alternatives to treat, to remedy the risk. So either we accept the risk acceptance. So for example, if it is, as we said in one of the matrix, it is insignificant, and it is very unlikely, and it is insignificant. If it happens, it is insignificant. It will has almost no consequence on the organization. So we accept it. We don't have to put in place any solutions that will cost us. So we choose here to accept the risk level. Okay. The other one is risk avoidance. We decide to avoid the risk, not proceeding with the activity or system that creates this risk. So we almost cancel or stop doing specific activities or stop using specific system in order to avoid that risk. We have other solutions, or we have other alternatives, or we can run our organizations without that system or activity in general, and we don't want to spend resources on having a countermeasure for that risk, so we try to avoid it. So we have risk acceptance, risk avoidance. The third one is risk transfer, sharing responsibility for the risk with a third party. And the best example for this is the insurance or service providers in general. Like, for example, if we have a risk on our data centers, we can have a cloud service provider. So we have a service level agreement, SLA, with the cloud service provider. So they will be responsible for that risk. So we transfer the responsibility of the risk from our organizations to the third party. But of course, there is a cost for that. But it is supposed to be less than the cost of if we are going to run that from our organizations and to be responsible about it. Okay, the fourth one is it is reduce consequences. Reduce consequences. We will try to reduce the consequences of that risk. So we will modify the structure or use of the asset at risk to reduce the impacts on the organizations if the risk happens. Okay. The last one, reduce the likelihood. Reduce the likelihood of that risk happening, of the occurrence of that risk. So we implement suitable controls to lower the chance of the vulnerability being exploited. We try to close the vulnerability or to lower the exploitation potential or probability. So these are the 5 risk treatment alternatives: risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk transfer, reduce the consequences, or reduce the likelihood. Okay, we come now to the end of this chapter. So we talked about IT security management. What are the 3 questions and what are the 8 functions? We talked about the organizational security risk assessment approaches, and we talked about some of the detailed security risk analysis that we need to consider, especially the risk